Thank you for a masterful talk of a very complicated subject, really clarified the science, give us some of your own personal experience. And now I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague, Wendy Mariner, who's the Utley professor at the School of Public Health, and she is going to moderate, make a comment or two, and then moderate a discussion on Gulf War syndrome, Gulf War illness.
Maybe we should just sit here?
Yeah.
Well, let me add my thanks to Dr. White. That was truly a masterful summary of enough. I mean, when you think about 400 pages of summarizing data, it's an extraordinary achievement. And also, I think an example of how research should be done. This is a really remarkable and balanced piece of work that analyzes things in a wonderful way, and I think that your presentation makes clear that that is often a rare event, or too often. Too often is hard. That if there is nothing we have learned from this is that science is politics also, and can heavily be shaped by the underlying feelings, experiences of those who conduct the research, those who are chosen to conduct the research, those who are organized to review it. And particularly in the case of diseases. Diseases can be highly politicized issues because they're financial issues. And it may make a difference. Diseases demand treatment, and it makes a difference whether treatment will cost someone money or will generate revenue for someone. So I noticed the difference between the enthusiasm for embracing a disease definition from, say, organizations like the pharmaceutical industry, medical device industry, that would push very hard for definitions, studies, treatments, and the like that could generate revenue, as contrasted with a disease that might cost the government money to provide benefits. And I wonder if there is an issue here, because you can see a different reaction in the impetus to study, come up with problems, come up with solutions to the issue. I wonder if you might have a comment on that.
Well, clearly, agencies like Center for Disease Control, which were not financially responsible for veterans, had a different take on whether they should take the health symptoms seriously and try to come up with a case definition than VA or DOD did. I think that that money played an important part in this from the beginning. And, you know, my own personal experience with it was when I started doing this research, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was caused by stress. I didn't know if it was caused by psychiatric disorders. I didn't know if it was caused by chemicals. I had no idea. Picking up the chemical signal as the important signal happened because of my data. And as I started finding the chemical causation and following on the chemical signals, I started getting less funding for my work from the VA. They took away my center, actually. Or actually, they didn't quite take it away. They changed it to another environmental hazard center that didn't look at Gulf War illness anymore.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question about the structure of research in the country in general, and we may want to talk about this, and that is the ways in which someone who follows the data may be challenged. Sometimes people worry that a voice that happens to support an unusual view or an emerging view can be just an extreme oddity, or it can be a harbinger of what is real and true. Think about a dissent that ultimately becomes the majority opinion. So this is, pursuing that, I think, is extremely difficult in these circumstances, and it's nice that we still have people who do that. Let me kick off one question before I open it up to everyone else. I noticed that your report makes clear that the charge, at least the charter to the committee, says that the committee's work, the guiding principle for the committee's work is the premise that the fundamental goal of all Gulf War-related government research is to improve the health of Gulf War veterans, and the choice and success of federal Gulf War research should be judged accordingly. So how are we doing?
Well, I think we're doing better than we did. We have been working with IOM, with VA, with Department of Defense, trying to focus Gulf War illness research more, trying to take advantage of the funds that we actually have, trying to keep these agencies from simply sending out requests for proposals that have no specific focus, and instead trying to focus in on the issues as they've evolved. I don't think we've been 100% successful. We have in the last year gotten VA to agree to have a high-level scientific advisory committee that's going to oversee the research that they do in the next few years. I'm on that committee, and I can tell you I'm not sure yet if it's going to be successful in doing that or not. We may just be a pointless group of people, but that has happened. I am now chair of the Committee for Department of Defense that reviews Gulf War illness proposals that come in, and I've tried to really guide the request for proposals in terms of really trying to solve these issues the way I put them forward just now. I think we're making progress on that, and some members of the RAC are on that committee as well, including Anthony Hardy, who's here and going to speak this morning. So I think we're having some successes. I think there's a long way to go.
Thank you. I know that there's a lot of questions bubbling in the audience, and so I won't take any more time with my microphone. So let me just see if I can identify those who have some questions. I know Dr.
Master of Ceremonies. Mike Roden. You said that we're now ready to move on to treatment trials. And I wonder if you could comment on what are the treatment trials and what kinds of things are they trying to look at and trying to focus on?
The treatment trials, where we are with treatment trials is there's been a huge argument all along about whether you can do treatment before you know the cause. So there have been some people who said, well, many diseases have been treated before we knew the cause effectively, just by simply empirically trying different kinds of treatments. So there have been a number of treatment trials started in recent times looking at antioxidants and other kinds of natural approaches to Gulf War illness, and a number of alternative medicine approaches to treating Gulf War illness. People are now developing treatment trial protocols. There's an RFA from the Department of Defense for pilot studies where we look at small groups of Gulf War veterans and try to move to a big treatment trial. Some of those try to key in on the neuroinflammatory and autoimmune mechanisms with different kinds of medication. There's been talk of genetically engineered or individual-specific treatment protocols, but we're really in the infancy of these treatment trials at this time.
Is there any data? Is there any data on any of those trials early?
Very little. I don't think we found an effective treatment yet.
Questions? We had one there. Professor Miller?
Hi, my name is Fran Miller from the law school. The VA has a reputation for delivering excellent care across the board. And I just came from an NIH conference where their successes across the board in everything from personalized medicine to comparative effectiveness studies, et cetera, were laid out. I'm trying to reconcile that reputation, which is pretty solid, with this kind of, I don't know what kind of word to use, disregard of Gulf War syndrome or whatever, Gulf War illness, whatever the thing is. Are you telling me that veterans were not putting the causation issues to one side? Were veterans coming back with these symptoms, were they not being treated? Were they being dismissed as malingering? I'm trying to put it together with the other reputation.
Well, I think the VA is a very big and multifaceted thing. When you're dealing with certain kinds of disorders, hypertension, there have been many disorders that the VA has developed really good treatments for in their cooperative studies program, which is a world light in research. Comparative effectiveness research has been a very important VA initiative. I think in terms of the Gulf War veterans, what happened was they did not understand what was going on. They became entrenched at various times in psychiatric explanations of it and even malingering explanations of it. Physicians in local VA centers did not know what was going on, did not receive sufficient guidance on how to treat Gulf War veterans, were not really imbued in a culture of taking the Gulf War veterans seriously and trying to treat them for their problems. I certainly think that this did happen. I heard it from many, many Gulf War veterans. One big problem with the VA in terms of treating this illness, and if I'm right, it's a chemically induced environmental or occupational illness. People in the fields of environmental and occupational medicine understand this illness. They understand what the manifestations of chemical exposures can look like, and I think they would have had a different attitude toward the veterans had they seen them, but we don't have that kind of expertise in the VA. So early on when I had my center, veterans were calling for that kind of expertise. There were assignments of people who were in charge of the environmental and occupational approach to Gulf War veterans at various VAs, but they weren't specialists in this kind of medicine. They weren't board certified in this kind of medicine. So my own theory is that people didn't understand what it was, and you know what happens when physicians and other healthcare providers don't understand what's going on with an illness, they tend to blame the patient or throw up their hands. And that's the report I've heard from so many Gulf War veterans that I have to believe it's true.
If I can just add a footnote to that before we get to the next question. I happened to sit on an Institute of Medicine study which was initiated by the Veterans Administration to Department of Veterans Affairs to study ways to provide tobacco cessation for soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan and veterans as well, but primarily for soldiers who are. And the impetus, you may ask, there may be other more important health threats than smoking when you're at war, but that was not our job. The impetus for that did actually come from one small person who wanted more funding for the smoking cessation program, which is fine. But the clear need, the clear reason that the VA supported this was because it was looking ahead to the future population of veterans returning from the wars and worried that high levels of smokers deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan would translate into higher numbers of veterans at the VA. Now, that was largely with respect to the cost of health care. With respect to other kinds of programs, such as other kinds of illnesses, there are even larger or equivalent amounts of money at stake, which are benefits for veterans, and deployment-related benefits for illnesses there. So there was a large financial element that could also be pressuring one to take a look at reducing the likelihood of having to take care of people. There's a budgetary concern that's always at stake in government. We have more questions, I know, there in the rear. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. I admire your political correctness. I'm Dr. Unger. I'm a retired Bronx medical examiner and physician and an attorney. And now I see the people you're talking about, not in academia, not in a setting, but in a private practice. I have a three-part question, actually. One, has any of the data been extrapolated for what their MOS was, their military occupation, while they were at the Gulf? Because I've seen an abundance of themic cancer, which you know is rather odd to see in a 30-year-old male, and usually they're Marines. Second part is, in dealing with the VA, it is a reality. And many of the veterans coming back, including us old fart Marines that were in Vietnam, think of the VA as the evil empire because they will delay until someone passes away and they don't have to pay for the benefits. So for the lawyers in the audience who are going to do their disability claims, which I do, there's a reality that the VA is very money-orientated. So when you're dealing with this, you know, the biggest problem with the VA is apathy, is that you go into the VA and many times these kids are seeing a physician that English was not a first language, that they have a hard time explaining it to them, and then they walk out with a bag of pills. If I told you how many bottles of OxyContin I have taken away from guys who get 300 OxyContins at a clip, you'd faint. So my question is, when you say treatment regime or treatment panel, I mean, I've attributed the themic cancer to the hydrocarbons from the burning fuel and actually been successful with it. But my real question is there anything that's driven by their MOS is to show where they were stationed, what their job was, that they had more symptoms than someone who was, say, in the periphery?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question. There have been some efforts to look at where people were and their symptoms and their health problems. We know that people who were in the area of the Kamasia detonation that I talked about are more likely to have brain tumors. We're now trying to figure out if there are relationships between where people were and later development of disorders like multiple sclerosis, ALS. ALS seemed to be a little more common in the Army, I believe. The CBs were studied extensively by Robert Haley. They weren't even in the same place as the other people. So it's still quite a complicated question. And we do know, for example, that there were specific kinds of problems among pesticide applicators, but there were only 700,000 people there. And some of the illnesses that we're talking about, cancers, some of the other illnesses have a very low incidence and prevalence. So it's very, very hard to figure out causation. 700,000 seems like a lot of people, but some of the outcomes that we've tried to look at have been very difficult with that small population. Probably the biggest problem has been with birth defects. We think there are birth defects related to Gulf War experience, having been in the Gulf War in offspring, but birth defects are very rare, so that looking at the odds ratios of developing them is very difficult. The other thing about where people were in the Gulf, they were moving constantly. So the research that we've done looks at unit level data, where a person's unit was, so their data, or if we looked at the relationship between health and a specific location, you're A, looking at a moving target, but B, you're looking at unit level data, and an individual might or might not have been with their unit and might or might not have been in the place that we think they are. The other thing about those troop location data is that they were not kept in any computerized form. So when I started doing this research, the data on the records on where units were on pieces of paper in boxes in storage somewhere in Washington. And I asked for the data on the units in the Devens cohort. It took me 4 years to get it, and I was the first person to get data because they had to translate these written records into computerized data. So there are some articles out there on location and health problems, and there's even a couple on brain imaging and neuropsych, but those are all related to the detonation of the munitions depot. We think there were other incidents of nerve gas agent exposure, and it's my understanding that the records on that the Pentagon has on chemical releases and all the written information they have has now been released or has been ordered to be released, and that may give us a whole new way of looking at all of this again. But that's a brand new development.
I'm Leonard Glantz at the School of Public Health. So, Bobby, I was wondering if you could reflect a little on the politics of science. You had something on the science, and then you had something on politics. But I'm wondering about the politics of the science. So you said during your comments that the IOM is the arbiter of science, and what you demonstrated here is that that's not true. That that they're willing to be limited in the questions that they answer. That the Pentagon asked the IOM in its earlier report to do something and wouldn't let them look at certain things. That the outcome is pretty much determined by the question. It also seems to me that the initial studies were done purely for purposes of compensation. That the question, should people be compensated for their loss or get treatment in the VA, that the initial studies would have a giant impact on that, which is one of the reasons why there was so much dispute about it. So as a scientist doing this stuff, how were you and how do you think your colleagues were affected by the fact that the outcome wouldn't just have scientific repercussions, but would have financial repercussions and social repercussions? So the Pentagon and the VA want you to find there's no problem. Advocates for the veterans would like these committees to find that there is a problem. It's not exactly like a neutral question. It's not like, what's the distance between the Earth and the sun? It's like an interesting question, but who really cares? This really has implications. So it seems to me the choice of people who sit on the panels, as well as the panel's awareness of sort of the social and financial outcomes, should affect them in some way. And one of those ways, I mean, what's interesting to me is you showed pictures of people with holes in their brains, and to me that would sort of, okay, there's a problem, that there's not that much to talk about at that point, but then one says, well, it's not really a problem. So how are the scientists affected by the knowledge of the social implications of their work?
Well, I think that's a good question, Leonard, and I think it bothered me personally at a very deep level when I was doing this work. As I explained earlier, I felt when I started looking at the issue that I didn't know what was going on with Gulf War veterans. I didn't know if this was a physical illness or some kind of stress-related disorder or something else. I tried to pose my scientific questions so that I would get an answer that I could believe in. I did this in the context of being a VA scientist, having much of the work that I was doing being supported by VA, and when you work for the VA, if you do media interviews, if you talk to people outside the VA, you have to get clearance first. I was working in an environment as a scientist in which there was pressure from the VA, in which many people in VA and many people in charge of funding had a very concrete idea of what was going on. As I continued with my work, it became very obvious to me that their idea was not the answer. It also became very obvious to me that veterans did not trust the VA, did not trust the DOD. When I started the Boston Environmental Hazard Center, I had a Veterans Advisory Committee that I worked with, who told us a lot about what went on in the Gulf. They were people that I could go to and say, this is what people are telling me in the studies. What do you know about it? How should I follow this up? They helped design some of the questions. These people at first said, how can I trust you? How can I work with you? You know, you're a VA scientist. How do I know you're not just going to toe the party line and say we're crazy or we're making this up or whatever? So I had to work very carefully initially as a scientist to form good relationships with veterans, and I think I did, because I think that people both in the VA and in the veteran community actually believed that I was trying to answer my questions in a scientifically valid way, that I was approaching the issues around Gulf War illness as a scientific question. And I think science is the arbiter of this for politics. But I have to say that I lost my funding, or a lot of my funding, for a while. It came back when people decided they better pay attention to me because I was one of the first people to do work in this area. I saw people who wrote papers on both sides of the issue saying it's just PTSD, quote unquote, or it's really physical. I saw people produce irrelevant papers looking at health outcomes that couldn't be related to exposures and saying, oh, this health outcome didn't occur, therefore it's not caused by chemicals. I saw all kinds of things going on. I called for certain kinds of pre-deployment research before Iraq using brain imaging and other kinds of techniques at a very early stage, and I did not get that funding. So I have to say, I think politics is really important and it affects science, and that if you want to have your research funded, if you work in these agencies, sometimes you make certain kinds of decisions. I certainly feel that some people made decisions that were different than the ones I would have made. I have to say, Leonard, I feel a little bit embarrassed talking about this, like I'm outing people or something, but boy, science occurs in a very political environment, and I think scientists have to do their best to be objective, and that's the only way we can really advance understanding of politically charged illness and help get to important things like treatments and cures and prevention.
We have a couple people up here who have questions, right? Did you have a question? No? Okay, Kara.
Kara Shea at School of Public Health. I'm puzzled by something. It's this sort of a two-parter. On the one hand, you said in response to Professor Miller's question that the theory that this was psychologically based led to dismissing veterans' complaints. On the other hand, the shift from the theory of psychological to your findings of a physical or a chemical cause led to a loss of funding, and I'm having difficulty reconciling those two things. And the other is to the extent that there's now it's accepted that there's a chemical cause. You mentioned that the CDC has a definition that's a little broader. My impression when you said that was that you weren't too keen on there being this falling within a broader definition, but I wonder whether that doesn't benefit the people who are suffering to know that they're actually part of a larger population that suffers from a more widely accepted illness, to the extent that you can answer those.
Well, no one knows what chronic multi-symptom illness is. I think that the the chemically induced occupational illness definition is a lot narrower. I think what the Gulf War veterans are experiencing is similar to a bigger population, but it's the population of pesticide-exposed workers in the United States. So there's a big study on agricultural workers with pesticide exposure that's being done by NIEHS, National Institute of Environmental Health Scientists. And the findings from that study we've heard about extensively in the RAC. These kinds of agricultural workers have a very similar syndrome to the Gulf War veterans. So to me, that's the appropriate population of interest, not some ill-defined. Every time you say it's a symptom-based illness, it's an undefined illness, I think you're calling what's happening into question. I'm not for a very stringent case definition of Gulf War illness. I think one could be developed that involves, like post-traumatic stress disorder, exposure to Gulf War theater, plus certain symptoms and signs that would apply broadly to the Gulf War population. We're still debating whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. And I haven't seen the definition that solves the problem yet, but on the other hand, I don't think the science has been done to try to do that. I think with a big enough population, which VA is talking about assembling right now, of Gulf War veterans, we stand a chance of looking at whether that's a good idea or not. Now, with regard to your first question in terms of the psychologically versus the chemically, I think the reason I lost my funding my funding decreased was because VA was invested in the psychological explanation. If I had concluded that Gulf War illness was post-traumatic stress disorder, I think that they would have been happier with me as a scientist than they were that I concluded that this was a chemically induced illness caused from exposures in theater. So I think my problem was more around a disjunct between what people in control of the research program at that time believed and what I came to believe based on my data. I also think, and maybe Dr. Grodin will get to this afternoon, very often when I talk about Gulf War illness, I talk about the mind-body dichotomy. And I think that's a false dichotomy. And when you're talking about psychological illnesses or psychological manifestations of illness, I think that the conversation can become very complicated. So chemicals like pesticides do cause changes in mood. They don't usually, except with really high exposures, cause major depression, things like that. They can at very high exposure levels, but chemicals affect the brain, affect neurotransmitters, affect the limbic system, and therefore they do affect psychological responsivity. It's not post-traumatic stress disorder, but these people with chemical exposures do have changes in their mood and changes in their energy. And so when you get into these arguments about is it a psychological condition or is it a physical condition, to me it's kind of a false question. I don't think that Gulf War illness is a formal diagnosable psychiatric disorder. I think it has manifestations in mood and energy, however. And so I think when you try to look at these things in a very sophisticated and complicated way, you get beyond people's stereotypes and their ideas about what is what, and it becomes very confusing. And as a scientist and as a neuropsychologist, sometimes I think it's been hard for me to convey that message. I've said repeatedly that pesticide workers, people with occupational exposure to nerve gas agents have low energy. They have these kind of chronic dysthymic things after long-term exposure. We see that in Gulf War veterans. That is that's part of the effect of the chemical. I just think it's very difficult to tease these things out, and it's very difficult to get these messages across clearly.
In the back there?
Morning. My name's Tom. I'm a veteran of the Coast Guard from 92 to 98, so most of my deployments were out in the Caribbean. But I had a question because I'm with the VA and I see these people coming in and out from Vietnam to, and even before that, to where we are now. And I compare the illnesses that are effective right now with Agent Orange and what's happening now. And I see a lot of people dying off after 20, 30 years after they get Agent Orange exposed. And I was wondering what the extent of the whole thing was with this whole thing with the Persian Gulf. And I was also wondering with the VA, in regards to if they recognize what's going on and we're doing something now with the whole thing, are they gonna like establish roaming disability boards to try to get people that are with Agent, not with, well, that too, but with the Persian Gulf War era, label it with, and if they're gonna maybe try to go around the country with that, instead of just saying, put the claim in, we'll get back to you.
I'm going to let Paul Sullivan talk about the disability part. In terms of what you raise with Agent Orange and other chemical exposures, I think you make a very good point. I put on one of my slides that early on there was an article that said, we have to expect that people came back with physical complaints because this happens after all wars. Well, in the Civil War, we had lead exposure. In World War I, we had nerve gas agent exposure. In World War II, we also had some nerve gas agent exposure. In Vietnam, we had Agent Orange. In the first Gulf War, we had pesticides. Now we have burn pit exposures in Iraq. There have been chemicals around for a long time, and I'm sure a subset of the illnesses that people have had from all wars have been related to chemicals. It's just that this war, the Gulf War, had very low mortality at the time of the war, was very short, so certain issues that have been brought up that happened in other wars, certain kinds of trauma didn't occur, so that the chemical question was a lot clearer. The mortality studies, I believe that was part of your question also, on Gulf War veterans to date are not showing that they die at a particularly young age yet, but I think they're finally getting to the age where with longitudinally following them, we're going to understand more about cancer risk and whether service in the Gulf War is shortening life. I'm not sure that we have the answer to that yet.
Do we have, I can't see the clock. Do we have time for another question or two? Oh, okay. We don't. Okay. One more question. If someone wants to follow up. This has been a very interesting discussion. Yes. Oh, Leonard, how long do we have?
So, Bobby, you mentioned that there doesn't have to be a dichotomy between mind and body.
I'm sorry, I can't
There
hear you.
doesn't have to be a dichotomy between the
Right.
mind and the body. So I'm just wondering, why has that mattered? Whether or not it's a psychological illness or a physical illness. Does the outcome of that question matter to the VA or to anybody else in some way?
I think the reason that it mattered in this instance was that I think the term psychiatric disorder was used in a disparaging way toward the veterans. And the veterans who had physical symptoms that they did not think could be explained on the basis of having a depression or having a stress disorder, which some people with Gulf War illness do have PTSD and do have depressive and other disorders. I think that they felt that the mind-body dichotomy was being used to dismiss them. It was not used in a complex understanding of what happened to them, and it was used to dismiss their physical complaints. So they felt that they were not taken seriously. I mean, the worst was when they were accused of malingering. And I heard it myself. I heard people say that myself, which is pretty frightening.
Thank you very much. Dr. Groden?